Housing prices and interest rates have been skyrocketing recently. Affordability is going down, and talks of a recession are getting louder and louder. Are we about to see another housing crisis and a crash like we did back in 2008? That's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Hi, I'm Josh Alexander with The Brokerage and your host of Orange County Housing Market News, your one-stop shop for all things Orange County real estate. So on today's episode, I'm going to be discussing the differences between 2008 and now in the housing market to give us a better idea if we can expect home prices to fall significantly over the next couple years. So if you're a buyer that's been sitting on the fence and not wanting to purchase a home because you think a giant housing crash is coming, this is an episode for you. So let's go ahead and get into it. So if you've watched or listened to this show before, you probably already know where this episode is going because we've covered this data in bits and pieces over the last couple months. However, today we're going to bring it all together and give it to you all in one episode to give you a better understanding using data as to why the housing market of 2008 is completely different than the housing market of today and why that means you should not be expecting a giant housing crash anytime soon. Now, before we get into that data, I do want to remind you, if you didn't watch last week's episode, I went over why recession doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see any type of housing correction. And in fact, oftentimes when we have recessions, housing prices go up. So if you haven't checked the episode out yet, I'll put a link up in the corner here, or you can go check that out because that kind of gives you some background on what we're going to talk about today. So on today's episode, it's really going to come down to two giant factors on why the housing market of 2008 was completely different than the housing market that we're experiencing today. And that has to do with inventory and responsible homeowners and lenders. So let's go ahead and talk about inventory first. So everybody knows by now we have a giant lack of supply, not only in Orange County and in Southern California, but throughout the entire United States in general. We've had that lack of supply for a very long time, and COVID just made things worse. So just to give you a quick example to show you how dramatically different the inventory levels were in 2008 compared to where they are right now in Southern California, if you go back to 2008, we had about 120,000 homes on the market in Southern California. Can you guess how many homes we currently have on the market right now? Just a little over 19,000. It's a completely different story when it comes to inventory right now. We have nowhere near enough inventory on the market in Southern California right now to satisfy the current demand, and those numbers aren't going to be changing anytime soon. There's nothing showing that we're going to have thousands of homes hit the market all at once, driving us into some type of buyer's market over the next couple of months or even year, showing that all of a sudden you're going to see home values decline. The inventory levels are starting out at such a low amount that even if inventory does rise a little bit, we're going to be nowhere near where we need to be able to satisfy demand. So let's go ahead and check out the first graph. So if you're listening to this on podcast, I apologize, but I'll go ahead and try to walk you through it as much as I can. Otherwise, feel free to check out the YouTube video that's attached in the link below, and that way you can see all the charts as well. So this first chart is basically showing you the amount of months of inventory that we had on the market leading up to the Great Recession compared to the months of inventory we have on the market right now. And what months of inventory basically means is if we put no more homes on the market starting today, how many months would it take for all the inventory in the United States to completely sell out? So leading up to the Great Recession, we had anywhere from 7 to 9 months of inventory on the market. If you look at today's market, over the last 2 years, we're hovering under 2 months of inventory. So if no homes hit the market, we would sell out of all of the homes in the United States in less than 2 months. That shows you what a dramatic difference we've seen in the amount of inventory from 2008 compared to where we are right now. Now you might be thinking, well, what if inventory went up? I hear that inventory is starting to rise because interest rates are causing some people to back out of the market and demand is going down and inventory is slowly rising. It would take so much inventory on the market all at once to get us anywhere close to just a balanced market, not to mention a buyer's market, that it really just is not plausible to happen anytime in the foreseeable future. Now, why is inventory so low to begin with, and why is it going to stay low? Let's go over some of that data as well so you can understand why I don't see inventory rising to any significant levels anytime again in the near future. So the first reason that inventory levels are so low right now and have been for a while is that home builders have been underbuilding for over a decade now. So after the Great Recession, where home builders lost a lot of money, a lot of them went bankrupt, they were scared, and rightfully so. They didn't want to overbuild again, so unfortunately they went the opposite direction and started to build less and less homes, starting basically in 2008, going up until about 2 years ago. So for more than a decade, we've seen home builders not build enough homes to satisfy demand, and that is one of the reasons that inventory levels have remained so low. And home builder sentiment has recently started dropping because interest rates have gone up as well. So although we have seen home builders start to accelerate over the last couple years, I do expect to see those numbers start dropping as home builders again get scared by anything in the market that remotely shows that less homes might be built in the future. They are taking the cautious approach now because they were burnt so bad during the last Great Recession. So reason number 2, inventory levels are going to stay so low, and this is something I've brought up over and over again, is right now the largest demographic patch ever in the history of the United States, the millennials, are now reaching peak first-time home buying years.
It's about passing the mantle to the millennials.
And that's age 32 and 33. So if you check out this chart up here, this shows you not only how big the millennial population is, but you can see within that population that there's a spike happening where the majority of millennials are now turning to that age where they're looking to purchase a home. And that has been basically happening from 2020, and it's going to continue happening all the way until 2024. Well, those numbers, although will start to drop, will still remain relatively high because the millennial generation is just so large. So what the millennials have basically done since 2020 is set a very high floor for the minimum demand that you're going to see in the housing market. And again, that's going to last until at least 2024 before it starts to slowly decline. So over the next 2 years, you can expect a lot of millennials to be purchasing homes. In fact, last year, we can see in the data that millennials were the #1 group of home buyers in the entire US market. So this is not just me guessing that millennials are buying homes. We have the data to show that millennials are buying more homes than anybody else right now. So reason number 3 why you're not going to see inventory be shooting up anytime soon is that homeowners are staying in their home much longer than they used to. So back in the 80s and 90s, it wasn't uncommon for someone to purchase a home and then 7 to 10 years later move into a different property. However, in today's market, in Orange County specifically, depending on what report you're looking at anywhere from 15 to 20 years on average people moving homes. So it's locking inventory up and creating more of an inventory problem because people are just not putting their homes up for sale. And on top of that, because interest rates have gone up, those people that are in homes that refinanced or purchased a home at a very low interest rate in the 2s and 3s, they see those relatively high interest rates at 5.5%, even though that's not bad for historic norms. And they really don't want to move because now they're saying, I have to spend hundreds of dollars or more on my mortgage every single month because those interest rates have gone up. And yes, I understand that interest rates are not the primary reason why homeowners decide if they want to move or not, but when interest rates have changed so significantly, it is a contributing factor. If they're trying to buy a property at the same price and are now spending hundreds of dollars more, it's going to make them pause. It's going to make them say, should I add an addition to my home? Should I pull some money out of my house and update it the way I want to so I don't have to move? Those are all things that are going through current homeowners' heads right now, and they're figuring out ways to stay in their property longer. So between home builders underbuilding for a decade now, millennials keeping demand relatively high over the next couple years, and on top of it all, homeowners are not moving anywhere near as often as they used to, you can see why the data is showing that inventory levels are just not going to raise significantly over the foreseeable future. Yes, interest rates have caused inventory to start to rise slowly, which is great for the housing market. It means that appreciation is finally going to start getting back to a more normal level instead of the crazy pace we've seen over the last 2 years. But we're already seeing at 5%, 5.5% interest rate, there's still plenty of demand out there to be able to eat up any of this inventory that's coming on the market. Yes, days on market is starting to get longer. However, that's completely healthy for the housing market. Right now, the days on market, which means the day you put the sign in the yard and put it on the MLS to when it goes into escrow, is still only 34 days. So we'd have to get to over 90 days before it's even considered a balanced market, and over 120 days before we got to a slight buyer's market where you start seeing home values go down. We are nowhere close to that right now, and it doesn't look like we're going to be getting to that anytime soon. So that's the data I have on the inventory side of things. So now let's go ahead and look at the second giant reason why the housing market today is set up so much differently than the housing market right before it crashed back in 2008. And it has to do with responsible lenders and responsible homeowners. So let's go ahead and start with the lender side first. So if you remember back in the housing crisis, one of the main reasons we saw home values fall so much was because lenders were giving out extremely risky loans to buyers without checking and verifying their income, their jobs, their assets. If someone said, I make $1 million and I want to purchase this home, a lot of lenders would just give them the loan for it and take their word for it. Obviously, looking back at this point, we know that that was extremely irresponsible, not only for the lender, but for the home buyer as well. The lender should have never given out those loans without checking and verifying income, job, assets, and the home buyer should never have put in, I make $1 million when they make $100,000 a year. So let's go ahead and look at this chart up here. So this chart is basically breaking down how many risky loan products were given out by year for the last 20-ish years or so. And on top of that, how risky the actual borrower was who was getting those loans. So as you can see, as soon as we had the housing crash, there were tighter regulations put into place, and those risky loan products pretty much disappeared from this graph. And on top of that, you can see that the people borrowing the money were also a lot less risky than they were before the housing crash, and that had to do a lot with the regulations that were put in place as well. So let's go ahead and now dive even deeper into these risky loan products and check out some more data. So if you think about the housing crash and the housing crisis that we had, and you think about loan products, what pops into your head? Most likely, it's going to be the ARM loans, so adjustable rate mortgages. That's where you get an introductory rate, which is going to be very low and attractive. However, after a set amount of years, usually 3, 5, 10 years, that rate is now going to adjust to whatever the current mortgage rate is. And that's what got a lot of people in trouble, because all of a sudden, overnight, their monthly mortgage payment went up by hundreds of dollars, and they could no longer afford their mortgage payment. So when you take a look at this graph up here, it shows you year by year breakdown what percentage of all loans out there were given out that were actually ARM products. And if you look at it, the 3 years prior to the housing crash, over 30% of all loans given out were adjustable rate mortgages. This is obviously not a good thing, especially when these homeowners did not qualify for them, and one of the main reasons we saw that housing crash. Now, if you take that and continue looking at the data lines after the housing market crashed, you can see that pretty much every year since, we've been at 5% or under for those ARM products. They're almost non-existent when you look at a grand scheme of things in terms of the amount of people getting ARM products in today's market. And that's one of the reasons why loans today are so much less risky than they were back then. And on top of that, if you apply for an ARM product today, lenders are required to do a secondary check that basically says that yes, you can afford not only today's rate, but if rates were to go up in the future, you have to be able to afford that rate as well in order to qualify for the ARM product. So overall, even though there are a few ARM products left out on the market, the people that have those products are much more well qualified, even if their rates do adjust upwards. So in today's lending environment, lenders are now verifying your assets, they're verifying you have income, they're verifying your job, usually multiple times while you're in escrow. And on top of that, if you do decide to apply for any type of loan product that might be considered risky, they're basically overqualifying you to make sure that if rates go up, you're not going to have an issue paying for it. What else are they doing? Well, on top of it all, they're also making sure that your credit score is much higher. They want to make sure that you have the history showing that you make payments on time and you're not going to have issues paying for these loans. And again, I like to use data, so let's go ahead and check out this graph up here. And this is basically showing you how many loan products were given out for people that had under a 620 credit score. So again, you can see that before the housing crash, they were giving out a lot of loans to people that didn't have high credit scores, and immediately after, you saw that dramatically drop. So only people that had higher credit scores were getting loans, which means that they were making payments on time, they had better credit history, they weren't having issues paying their other debt obligations before they applied for a mortgage. This just means that buyers applying for loans today have shown a much better history of paying their other debt obligations on time every single month, and are less likely to default on their payments and stop paying their mortgage. So again, it's one more thing that you can see in the data showing that people that are purchasing homes today are better qualified for it, and are more likely to continue making payments. So due to regulation, lenders are now only giving out loans to buyers that actually qualify for them. However, there was a second reason the housing market crashed, and that had to do with irresponsible homeowners. So are homeowners now more responsible? Let's go ahead and take a look. So the second biggest reason that the housing market crashed is back in 2006, 7, and 8, people were pulling a giant amount of equity out of their house because home prices were going up so quickly, and they were purchasing trips, they were going and buying RVs, boats, whatever they wanted. They were basically taking chunks of money out of their home and doing whatever they wanted with. And that left them with very little equity. So when the housing market started to turn, many of these homeowners found themselves underwater relatively quickly, even when prices just started dropping a little bit. And that just exaggerated the problem, because now we have a bunch of homeowners that were paying their mortgage on time, that can afford their monthly payments, now have negative equity in their house. And if they're forced to sell their home in the future, now they're going to have to take a loss on it. So have homeowners learned their lesson about equity and have stopped pulling so much of that equity out of their house even when home prices seem to be skyrocketing consistently? The answer, thankfully, is yes. So homeowners, although they are taking money out of their house, are not taking anywhere near as much money out of their house as they used to, and they're leaving a lot more equity in their home. So right now in the United States, homeowners have never had so much equity built up in their house. In fact, the average homeowner has $307,000 of equity in their house right now.
A gigantic pile of money.
So are they taking a little bit? Yes. Are they taking all the equity of their house and doing something fun with it? Typically not. They're usually taking it out maybe to help pay for college, taking out maybe to add some renovations to their property, but they're leaving a sizable chunk of equity in their property, so that way if the housing market did turn for any reason, they're not going to be underwater on their home. They're still able to sell it at a market rate, and they're going to be able to make a profit on the home. So lenders are acting more responsibly, homeowners are acting more responsibly. It's overall a much healthier housing market than we saw back in 2008. So that leads us to the last thing that I wanted to talk about today, which is going to be forbearance and foreclosures. So it's something that's come up very frequently over the last 2 years, ever since we started the forbearance process, where we had millions of people in the US go into forbearance, so they had the opportunity to stop paying for their home loan if they needed to. So let's go ahead and look at some of this data, because there's still people out there that I talk to that are saying, hey, I'm waiting for all these foreclosures to happen because there was a bunch of people in forbearance, and eventually all these foreclosures are going to hit the market. You're going to see a giant spike of inventory, which is going to drive prices down 20%, and then I'll be able to scoop up properties at a discount. The data shows there is no way that is going to happen. So let's go ahead and look over the data, because it's becoming clearer and clearer every single month as we get more and more data about not only forbearance, but also foreclosure numbers. Okay, so let's go ahead and start looking at some data. So this graph up here shows you that in March 2020, when forbearance was at its peak, we had about 4.8 million people in the forbearance program. And as you can see on this graph, every single month since March of 2020, we've seen the number of people in forbearance continue to drop to where it is now, which is around 690,000 people. Now you might be thinking, well, what's happening to all these people that are exiting forbearance? Are they going into foreclosure? Are they having issues with payments still? What's going on with that? Well, luckily, we have data on that as well. So this handy little pie chart up here is showing you what happened to everybody once they exited forbearance. And they broke it down into 3 different categories. So the first category, which is 37% of people that exited forbearance, either sold their home or paid off their mortgage in full. Another 45% of people that exited forbearance came up with some type of payment plan with their bank. They maybe put the payments that they missed on the back end, they caught up on payments, or some way that's going to keep them from losing their house and going into foreclosure. Then you have the people that are still going to be in trouble, which is about 18% of everybody that exited forbearance so far. So those 18% of people that are exiting without a plan could possibly still have some issues and end up in foreclosure. So you would think that we'd start to see foreclosure numbers start spiking at this point, because people have been exiting the forbearance program for almost a year at this point. So let's go ahead and look at the actual data when it comes to the amount of foreclosures that we've seen happen. Now, I will preface this by saying that yes, this data is going to be a little skewed, because there was a period of time during the foreclosure moratorium where you didn't see homeowners go through the foreclosure process. So obviously you're going to see very low numbers over the last year and a half. But that's actually not what I wanted to point out. What I wanted to point out is if you look at the data, what you can see in the blue lines going back and taking out the time period where we had all those foreclosures due to the housing crisis, you can see that the average foreclosure rate that we had in the United States was hovering around the 500,000 to 600,000 every single year. So yes, that data is skewed over the last year and a half. However, what I want you to remember and what I want you to take away from this graph is that over the years, typically we're going to see hundreds of thousands of foreclosures every single year, and that's normal. So if we have a bunch of these people that have exited forbearance, that 18%, some of them end up in foreclosure and have to sell their home, that's going to be a completely normal year. It's not going to be a giant spike of inventory. It's something that we see every single year as something normal in America. Although I don't want to normalize foreclosures and the pain that brings to families and people going through it, we have to understand that that's part of the housing process, and there are going to be a certain amount every single year that averages out. So if this year we see foreclosures go from 78,000 to 300,000 to 400,000, that's not something you need to be shocked about, because that's just us getting back to a normal housing market. So that's something that you want to consider and keep in the back of your head when you see these news articles coming out for clickbait showing that foreclosures are up 100%, 200, 300, 400%, because it's all relative, and you have to understand what the baseline is in order to really understand the data. So if you've watched the show to this point, hopefully you now understand that the chance there being any type of major market correction anytime in the near future is very slim. However, it's not zero.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
And I always am watching for any red flags that might indicate we might have some type of housing issue in the near future. So it's something that I want you to be aware of as well. And there's 6 main ones that I'm looking at. So number 1 is going to be unemployment rate. So if we do go into a recession and we start seeing unemployment rate rise, that just means that less and less homeowners are able to pay for their mortgage, and we could start seeing more foreclosures. Number 2 that I'm watching very closely is how much equity people are pulling out of their house. Like we just went over, right now, it's definitely not at any kind of concerning levels. However, over the next year or two, if we start seeing a massive amount of equity being pulled out of homes, that could be another red flag that we're watching for to show that if housing prices went down slightly, we could have a lot of issues with people being underwater on their mortgages, just like back in 2008 when that happened as well. So that's another number that I'm watching closely. The third thing that I'm watching is wages. So if we start seeing a stagnation in wages and they're not growing anymore, that could be concerning as well, especially if the housing market continues to appreciate, because that just means homes are going to be less and less affordable. And eventually you get to a point where they're no longer affordable to most people, and that's when you can see a slight correction start happening in the market. So that's another indicator that I'm watching. The fourth thing I'm watching is interest rates. So yes, interest rates have skyrocketed since the beginning of the year from about 3.1 to 5.4%. However, that's actually stabilized the market. So we've seen demand drop slightly, we've seen inventory slowly start rising, and that just indicates that we're heading towards a more healthy housing market where we see appreciation slow down, we see less offers on every single home, so buyers have more of an opportunity to get into a home, and that's where we want to be. We want to see slight appreciation every single month, because that's a good indicator that we're in a healthy housing market. However, if we see interest rates continue to climb at the rate we saw at the first half of the year, and they start reaching into the 7%, 8% range, I definitely think we're going to start seeing demand decrease significantly, and it could lead us to a point where we get back to a balanced market or even a slight buyer's market. However, even if interest rates head up that rate, it's not going to happen anytime soon. We're talking at earliest, maybe by the end of the year, if interest rates continue to skyrocket, that we'd see home values start falling. Again, it's not very likely to happen, but it is something that I'm continuing to watch on a daily basis to see where interest rates are heading, and that way I can notify you if I see any concerning trends with those interest rates. So the fifth thing that I'm watching is mortgage applications. So mortgage applications are how many new home buyers are applying for a mortgage to go out and look for a property. That's one of our best indicators of what the future demand is going to look like. So if we see mortgage applications continue to drop week after week at significant levels, that's just telling us demand is weakening week by week. And eventually you're going to get to a point where demand goes down so much that inventory is allowed to build up to a point where you're going to see a more balanced housing market, and again, maybe even a slight buyer's market. However, there's no indication that's going to happen anytime soon. It is something that I'm watching, and again, I'll let you know if I see any concerning trends. However, it looks like right now even though demand is slightly declining because of the higher interest rates, it's not declining fast enough to impact the market in any significant way. And the final thing that I'm watching, which is on everybody's mind right now, is going to be inflation. Inflation is the enemy of long-term interest rates. So the longer we have inflation, the better chance interest rates are going to continue to climb. So if we don't get inflation under control over the next couple months towards the end of the year, you can start to expect interest rates to continue to climb up as the Fed has to become more and more aggressive about raising their own interest rates to help slow down inflation. So that is something that you want to watch closely. If we don't get it under control and we don't see it flatline and start to come down over the next 3 to 6 months, we could be in for those higher interest rates like I was talking about, 7-8%, and that could really significantly slow the market down. So those are the 6 indicators that I'm watching on a weekly basis to see if there's any evidence of the housing market getting to a point where it's weak enough that I can foresee it becoming a balanced or even a slight buyer's market anytime in the foreseeable future. Okay, so this episode was jam-packed with data, and you might be thinking to yourself at this point, especially if you're thinking of buying or selling a home in the next year or two, all this information is great, but I don't want to have to keep track of all this data to figure out when might be the best time for me to buy or sell a home. Is there anything I can do? Yes, all you have to do, hit that like, subscribe button. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to hit the bell button as well. That way you're notified every single week when I release a new episode. And also make sure you're following me on all the social media channels. On Instagram, I'm posting multiple times a week what's going on with the market and different tricks and tips for both buyers and sellers. So if you want even more content, make sure you follow me there. All that information's in the show notes below. So until next time, stay healthy, stay happy, and I'll see you on the next show. Bye.